Hello, I'm Ben and you're watching The PhD Parent. So a shared goal of parenting researchers is the development of interventions that effectively reduce behavioural problems in kids. Most established parenting interventions, such as parent-child interaction therapy or parent management training, involve strategies such as positive reinforcement, timeout and privilege removal to improve kids' behaviour. There is a considerable body of evidence showing that these interventions, which have been described as light forms of positive parenting, are effective in reducing behavioural problems. Now, recent years have seen the development of parenting interventions such as tuning into kids or collaborative and proactive solutions, which do not involve the types of strategies just described, but instead focus on improving kids' behaviour by trying to help both parents and kids better manage their emotions, and also to develop effective ways of solving problems. These interventions are described as strong forms of positive parenting. The purpose of the current video is to provide a brief overview of the strategies involved in these strong positive parenting interventions. In another video, you can check out the link down below, I review evidence concerning the effectiveness of these interventions in reducing problematic behaviours in kids. So when I googled positive parenting, I got about 1.8 billion results. And a quick skim through the results quickly suggests that there are many experts out there, often with their own positive parenting program, tips, book, podcast, or whatever else. So there is a lot of information out there. But as far as I'm aware, only 2 strong positive parenting programs have been evaluated using randomized control trials or RCTs in terms of their effectiveness in reducing problematic behaviors in kids. One is tuning into kids and the other is collaborative and proactive solutions. Now, this is not my area of research and I'm relying on a paper by Holden, who are experts in the area, and these are the interventions they mentioned. And there are many other interventions out there, which to my untrained eye, I would have thought qualified as strong parenting approaches, but they weren't mentioned by Holden, so here we are. Now in the following, I'm going to do my best to provide an overview of these 2 evidence-based examples of strong positive parenting interventions. And I'm going to start with collaborative and proactive solutions. So the objective of collaborative and proactive solutions is to help parents and children develop an approach to problem solving that involves the collaborative input of both parties, which should be no surprise given the name. Now I'm going to go through this intervention quickly, and there are 2 reasons for this. First, only 2 studies have examined the effectiveness of collaborative and proactive solutions in terms of its capacity to reduce behavioural problems. Now there is evidence to support its use, but it's pretty light on, especially compared to tuning into kids. And second, tuning into kids also covers problem solving. So I'm going to spend most of the time talking about the latter. But back to collaborative and proactive solutions. So this intervention has 4 parts. The first part involves trying to work out which problems are common triggers for conflict between parent and kid, and how existing parental responses to such conflict may be, putting it diplomatically, less than optimal. The second part involves helping parents work out which problems they should first try to address. The third part involves working out which of the following 3 options a parent could use in response to a problem. First, solve it yourself as a parent. Second, solve it collaboratively with the input of both parent and child. And third, don't deal with it. The fourth part involves getting parent and child to practice the second option. So, in a nutshell, work out which problems involving your kid are most important to try and solve, and then work with them to try and come up with solutions. So now on to tuning into kids. As mentioned, compared to collaborative and proactive solutions, tuning into kids has a more extensive evidence base, which is why I'm focusing on it more heavily. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get my hands on the treatment manual for tuning into kids. As far as I can see, you need to have completed training before you can get access. So I can't provide a detailed account of the intervention. However, the developers of the intervention provide introductory information in their published papers and repeatedly point out that the approach draws very heavily upon the principles of emotion coaching. So I can't tell you exactly what goes on in tuning into kids. However, I can do the next best thing and provide an overview of emotion coaching. So to be clear, the following is at best an approximation of tuning into kids. But onto emotion coaching. So briefly, a key idea in emotion coaching is that behavioural problems in kids are partly driven by difficulties in managing negative emotions, such as anger, sadness, or anxiety. Thus, the idea is that by increasing a kid's capacity to cope with such emotions, this should lead to a reduction in behavioural problems. Now, there are 5 key parts to emotion coaching. 3 of these directly concern emotions, 1 is about communication, and the other is about problem solving. And I'm going to start with the stuff about emotions. So first up, think differently about your kids and your own emotions. So as I've covered in other videos, it's argued that the way we think about the world impacts how we feel and behave. Therefore, how we think about our kids' emotions may impact how we respond to our kids when they're emotion. The idea in emotion coaching is that you want to try and adopt a helpful way of thinking about your kids' emotions. So, for example, if you were to think that your kids' negative emotions are another thing you've got to deal with, or are a very challenging problem, or are a sign of your failings as a parent, then you may find it quite difficult to manage their negative emotions. But if you were instead to think of their negative emotions as an opportunity to build a better relationship with them and to guide their development, then you may find it easier to deal with how your kid is feeling. And the latter, of course, is the way of thinking that emotion coaching encourages. Now, a related idea, which may or may not be covered in tuning into kids or emotion coaching, but which clinical psychologists tend to talk about in therapy more generally, concerns how people, or parents, think about their own emotions. As I'll argue, the way in which parents think about their own emotions plausibly influences how they respond to their kids' emotions. So the idea goes like this. You can, and people do, tend to think about their emotions in terms of whether they're good or bad. That is, they make judgments about the feelings they experience. Now try and remember the last time you were feeling anxious or sad. Were you thinking it's good to feel like this, or it's okay to feel like this, or it's bad to feel like this? In my experience, people don't tend to think it's good to feel anxious or sad. Some people will come straight out and say they think it's bad and they really don't like it, but most people will say they think it's okay. However, when you push things a little, many of the folks who say it's okay usually end up saying something along the lines of, well, I know it's supposed to be okay to feel anxious or sad, but I really don't like it. In other words, they think it's bad. So it's not uncommon for people to judge emotions such as anxiety or sadness as being bad. And there are different reasons why such a judgment may come about. For example, it's bad because the feeling in and of itself is unpleasant. Or it's bad because you think that people will judge you negatively because of how you're feeling. Or it's bad because it violates a rule that you have for yourself. For example, I should always have it together. Now, there are probably plenty of other reasons. Whatever the case, the problem with judging your emotions in this way is as follows. Suppose you experience something that results in you feeling anxious or sad. For example, your boss needs to have a chat about your performance, or your pet dies. You then judge the feeling you have as being bad. To put it simply, the problem is that this judgment will most likely just add negative feelings to those that were already there. For example, if you judge your anxiety as being bad, then you may get anxious about the fact that you're feeling anxious. So what do? There are two options that are quite different from one another. First, some people argue that you should take a non-judgmental approach to your emotions. That is, how you're feeling is neither good, nor bad, nor okay. It just is. The second option is to make a judgment about your emotions, just not a harsh one. Now, I don't reckon you need to go around thinking that it's great to feel anxious or sad, but to the extent that you can be more okay about feeling anxious or sad, or whatever else, then you're more likely to avoid piling additional negative emotion on top of whatever you are feeling in the first place. Now bring it back to parenting. Suppose you do tend to judge feeling anxious or sad, or whatever other negative emotion, as being bad. What impact will this have on how you deal with the same emotions in your kid? There are probably a few different plausible outcomes, but the one I'll focus on is that you may be more likely to try and stop your kid from experiencing or expressing negative emotions. Exactly how this might look may depend upon the reason why you think feeling a negative emotion is bad. But for example, if you think it's bad to feel anxious or sad or whatever else, because you reckon the experience of that negative emotion is in and of itself unpleasant, then you may be more likely to rush in to save your kid from experiencing negative emotions. That is, you try and protect them from these emotions. Or if you think it's bad because you reckon that people judge others' emotional states, then you may be more likely to say to your kid things such as, you need to toughen up or stop crying. Or if you think it's bad because you reckon that it's important to always be cool, calm and collected, then you may be more likely to say to your kid things such as, you need to get it together, or again, stop crying. In each example, the parental response is not strongly recommended. So the idea is that by softening your judgments about negative emotions in terms of how bad they are, or by not judging your emotions in the first place, then you'll be less likely to engage in the types of unhelpful parental responses just described. So now on to the next bit in emotion coaching, which is develop your ability to identify your kids' emotions. Now the important thing here is to try and identify your kids' emotions early on, when they're mild, rather than only when their emotions become intense. The argument is that by identifying emotions when they're at a low level, you can intervene in ways that reduce the chances of everything blowing up. Now, one point many people make is that if you're not good at identifying your own emotions, then you'll probably have difficulty doing the same for your kid. So, for some folks, improving understanding of their own emotional life may be the best starting point. So next, label your kids' emotions. The idea here is that labeling an emotion can reduce its intensity. That is, you take something that may be unknown and therefore potentially scary and make it knowable. It's suggested that you use a range of words so that the child develops an extensive emotional vocabulary. For example, rather than just saying angry, you could also use mad, frustrated, or annoyed. Now, labeling emotions is a key ingredient of empathic communication, which I'm going to expand upon in the following. I'm not saying that any one part of emotion coaching is more important than the next, but the stuff about empathic communication that I'm about to describe, in my view, is critical. And if you can get it right, it can make a big difference. So, empathic communication. At its core, this is about encouraging you to become what the emotion coaching people call an empathic listener. In the following, I'll give a brief overview of what this involves. But first, a very quick detour. Now, I don't think empathic listening is a good label. The reason for this is that in everyday usage, the word listening refers to giving attention to sounds. But as you'll see, empathic listening is more than just attending to what another person is saying. So that's why I'm using the label empathic communication, as I think it does a slightly better job of capturing the approach. So back to the main road. A key assumption in empathic communication is that what people say does not always reflect exactly what's going on for them. There are often other things that they may be thinking or feeling which have gone unsaid. To illustrate, suppose your child says to you, "I wish I didn't have to go to school." Now, while there's no reason to doubt that they don't want to go to school, what else could your kid be thinking and or feeling that's gone unsaid, and in this case have led them to express this wish? So it could be, "I don't have any friends at school and that makes me feel sad." Or, "I find it hard to pay attention in class all day, which makes me feel really frustrated." Or, "I don't understand what I've been taught and I'm anxious about my grades." So the goal of empathic communication, at least as I would describe it, is to communicate with another person in such a way that enables you to develop an accurate understanding of what's going on for them, with the potential downstream benefit of this being that it may lead the other person to get a better understanding of what's going on for themselves. So the first bit of empathic communication is to go into an interaction with another person with the mindset, something along the lines of, my job here is to figure out what's going on for this other person. Second, when empathically communicating, you need to pay close attention not only to what a person says, but also to how they say it. For example, their tone of voice, body language, facial expressions. The latter can be a window into what is really going on. To illustrate, you ask your child how they're feeling. They say with their head bowed down and in a meek tone, "I'm okay." Now, if you're attending only to what they've said, then you'd be thinking everything's fine. But if you're also attending to the other signals, body language and tone of voice, it would be clear that everything is not okay. So the third thing, and this is probably the most important bit, the key technique you use to get a better understanding of what's going on for the other person is so-called reflective statements. Basically, these are statements that are your best guess about what is going on for the other person. So here's a straightforward example. Your child is at their friend's place and you tell them it's time to go home. And they say, "No, I'm not going home." Here, a reflective statement might be, "You're upset that we have to leave because you're having a good time." Seems like a good guess about what could be going on for your child. Now, I'll illustrate the use of reflective statements more fully in a moment, but first a quick word on why it's suggested you use reflective statements rather than questions. So in the previous example, you could have said the same thing as a question. That is, "Are you upset we have to leave because you're having a good time?" However, in empathic communication, reflective statements are used in preference to questions for at least a couple of reasons. And by the way, it's okay to ask questions, but the idea is to reduce their use. So one reason why there's a preference for reflective statements is that when using questions, you run the risk of a person feeling as though you're interrogating them, which can lead to them getting defensive. And that's not helpful if you're wanting to explore what's going on for them. So for example, remember how you felt the last time someone asked you, "Why don't you do that?" Also, asking a question can result in people distancing themselves from whatever they're experiencing. That is, a question invites a person to take a step back and evaluate what's going on for them, potentially in ways that lead them to second guess what they're thinking or feeling. Thus, the preference is for reflective statements rather than questions. And lastly, to give you a sense of the difference between reflective statements and questions, consider the following examples. You're feeling sad? You're feeling sad. When saying the question, the vocal tone of a typical English speaker will go up towards the end. When saying the latter reflective statement, you want your vocal tone to remain steady or turn down towards the end. Now, using reflective statements takes practice, a lot of practice. Reflective statements are not how we typically communicate. Instead, we usually give advice or ask a question or argue the point. So it's often going to be necessary to overcome these old habits. Nevertheless, while it takes work, using reflective statements is a skill that can be well worth learning. So to wrap this section up, I'll give a brief example that highlights the potential benefits of using an empathic communication approach. So suppose that mum usually puts Johnny to bed each night, but she's out with her friends for dinner and so it's up to dad. Johnny is crying and keeps saying that he wants mum. Here are two ways that dad could respond. The first, not using empathic communication, and the second, using the approach. So dad starts with, "Mum is out with her friends tonight, so I'm going to have to put you to bed." And Johnny keeps crying and says, "But I want mum." And dad says, "Don't worry, she'll be home soon and can give you a kiss goodnight." Johnny's still crying and says, "I want to see her. I don't want you to put me to bed." Dad says, "I'm sorry, there's nothing we can do about it, mate. She's out with her friends and we can't ask her to come home." And now at this point, Johnny just starts crying louder. So now consider an empathic communication response. So in this case, Dad starts with, "You're really upset and you want Mum to put you to bed." Johnny keeps crying and says, "Yeah, I don't want you to put me to bed." And Dad says, "You don't like that things are different tonight and you miss Mum." Johnny is crying, but a bit less intensely, and says, "I miss her." And then Dad says, "Yeah, you love Mum and you like it when she gives you a kiss goodnight." Johnny is sniffling now and says, "Yeah, I do." Then Dad says, "It's normal to feel upset when things we like change and when you miss Mum." Now at this point, Johnny has calmed down significantly, and Dad could now maybe say something about the fact that he doesn't like it when things are different either, throw in a hug, start to talk about how Mum will be home later, that she loves Johnny, and so on. Now notice in the second example that everything Dad said, except for the last line, was a reflective statement. So the main takeaway is that getting underneath what Johnny is saying, bringing to the surface the unspoken thoughts, acknowledging how he was feeling, and accepting his emotional response, you're more likely to have a positive impact on Johnny than jumping in with the reason and not addressing the emotion. So last but not least, we're on to problem solving. So if you engage in problem solving, the emotion coaching people outline a few steps to follow. Nothing groundbreaking here. And remember, this comes after you've empathically communicated with your child and labeled their emotion or emotions. So first of all, identify the problem and the goal. Emotion coaching people actually label this one with reference to goals only, which I don't think makes sense, in that it probably helps to know what the problem is before you set a goal. So sit down with your kid to work out exactly what the issue is and what they would prefer the outcome to be. That is the goal. Presumably their goal might not align with your own goal, and or it might be inappropriate, so there may be a need to negotiate a goal. Second, work out potential solutions. With older kids, you can probably get away with the conventional brainstorming approach, but with younger kids, you might have to do a bit more of the work. So make sure you give them a chance and engage with their ideas. And third, pick a potential solution and give it a crack. When picking the solution, you may have to gently guide the child away from solutions that are not practical. So that's it for my crash course in strong positive parenting interventions. If there's anything I've gotten wrong, or if you have any questions, then feel free to get in touch. Otherwise, happy parenting.